afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this very important webinar hosted by Risk2 Solution with support from Dr. David Bartlett from Griffith University. Before we go any further, we'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we all live, work and play, and acknowledge that we have attendees already from all over many lands within Australia and indeed internationally. We pay our respects to all elders past, present and emerging. While it's normally something that we look forward to running these webinars, sadly we are convening this webinar on the back of some very tragic events that have taken place this week in recent days in Sydney in particular, and acknowledging that the reason for this webinar is simply to share knowledge, to share expertise, to provide education, and to help the healing and help us move forward after these terrible events. We'd like to, firstly, as the entire panel and as the organising team, express sincere condolences to those that have been impacted by this event, indeed for the lives lost, and also for those whose quality of life, way of life, and sense of safety has been compromised by these terrible events. We'd also like to commend both Inspector Amy Scott and the brave police that have responded to these incidents, as well as the incredible bravery demonstrated by civilians that responded to both attacks, and also to store owners, tenants and others in the building that did remarkable things to preserve life, provide first aid, shelter people and so on. The bravery that has been demonstrated by our communities should not be second to the evil that was perpetrated by a few. We wish that everyone who has been injured that is still fighting shall have a quick and successful recovery. Now, we have been inundated over the last couple of days with requests. Certainly Risk2 Solution has a long history in providing training and support services around the active armed offender risk and security more generally. And we have been asked for comment. We've been asked to provide support and services, and we've been trying to figure out the best possible way to be able to do that. And we thought that this is an appropriate medium to bring together some true thought leaders to provide some education and advice that may help some people. So we recognise that while we are talking about two incidents that have just happened, this is an ongoing and evolving threat. This is something that is not going away. And we should not be treating these as isolated incidents that we just need to recover from, but rather incidents we must ensure do not continue to happen or that we mitigate to the best of our abilities to do so. The aim, as I said, of this webinar is to share knowledge and expertise. It is not to sell, it is not to promote anything, it is simply to provide the knowledge that we've acquired over many years and careers and decades of experience, both academically and practically, to the benefit of others. So I'll introduce our panel. Firstly, my name is Joe Saunders. I am acting as a moderator. I am an expert in occupational violence and aggression, as well as protective security, in particular houses of worship. I'm also the head of training and education at Risk2 Solution and the host of the Managing Violence podcast, the world's largest podcast on the management and prevention of violence. It is my great honor to be moderating this panel and also to be contributing where I can. So I'd like to go to our speakers now and provide each speaker with an opportunity for some opening thoughts. First, I would like to introduce Risk2 Solution CEO and one of Australia's leading thought leaders in security, Dr. Gav Schneider.
Thanks, Joe, and thank you all of us for joining us on such short notice. It's a somber time when we come together to talk about what we need to do to make sure that we minimize the impact of catastrophic violence on innocent people. But we should remember a few things. And I'm talking to you as somebody that grew up in South Africa, got into the security industry at a very young age, worked as a professional bodyguard all over Africa and Asia and lots of places you never want to go on holiday. And in my own right, I've probably trained well over 50,000 people in personal safety, issue prevention, etc. And it's very frustrating for everybody when incidents like this happen. There's often this mentality of who's to blame and whose fault is it? But realistically, we need to be drawing a line on how do we move forward and make sure that these things don't happen again. And if they do happen, which I have to say with a lot of concern, I would almost guarantee they will happen again. They will happen differently. They will happen in different structures. But anybody who's been in the security industry for at least a decade will know that these things are pervasive, ongoing, and copycats can be problematic. But equally, we need to look geopolitically at a few things. The world is in an interesting place, and it's a new place. We've never been hyper-connected via the internet the way we are. Social media seems to be the comfort place that people go to get facts, which actually seems to be more misinformation, disinformation in practice. And we've also fallen into a rut, which is not a new rut, but the rut has been an evolution over time where the perception is that we're an island. Australia is safe. And we are really good at taking action. If we look at the Port Arthur massacre and the way firearms, for example, were tackled post that incident, we're commended globally based on that action. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to see bad things happen. And we've, unfortunately seen this play out many times. Across our business, we train, consult with many, many stakeholders in lots of different sectors. And we've been noting since the end of COVID, a significant increase in aggression and violent behavior. And while, thank goodness, the majority of these incidents have not been as catastrophic or as publicized as the ones that have just happened, the reality is that people are getting mentally abused, physically hurt, and assaulted almost daily across a broad range of sectors. And we need to own that. If we don't own the fact that this stuff is happening, we cannot stop it happening. My last point before I hand over to my colleagues, because we've got a lot of stuff to cover, is that this is not a problem we can tackle alone. It's also not a problem that we can simply put to the authorities, law enforcement, government agencies, and make it their problem. This is a societal problem. The way our people behave and the way they make decisions, and if those decisions involve perpetrating violence, it affects us all. Law enforcement structures have limitations. That there's not unlimited resourcing for organizations who are trying to combat and counter these sort of violent acts. We all need to step up and do our part if we want to make sure that we're in a safe and secure Australia moving forward. And unfortunately, that is probably not an option, it's a requirement. And if we look back, for example, I'm sure Leanne's going to talk about this a lot. If we look at the work that the ANZ CTC started doing way back in 2016 and 17 around these sort of threat areas, this is not a new issue. We got distracted. We got distracted by COVID. We got distracted by cybercrime. We've been distracted by global wars and issues and pressures and challenges that are not going away. But we've got to learn to exist in a world where we face more than one threat type, more than one motivated type of attacker. And we've got to own the fact that we have a lot of ability to stop these things happening. And we'll spend the rest of the hour probably talking about that. Thank you, Joe. Long-winded intro, but thanks for having us.
Thank you very much, Gav. Our next panelist is Leanne Close. Leanne is a Chief Executive at Risk2 Solution, but she is also a former Deputy Commissioner of National Security at the Australian Federal Police and has an incredible background both in law enforcement and in national security thought leadership also. Leanne, your opening thoughts.
Thanks, Joe, and everybody. Thank you for inviting me on to this really important panel today. It is really a tough time for Australians and people in the community who've been affected by the incidents today. But there is so much going on, as Gav Schneider indicated there, across the globe, and Australia is not immune from any of that. It really impacts all of us in different ways. Having been a police officer at the Australian Federal Police for over 33 years, at both the local community levels right up into being responsible for national security in the AFP, and working with amazing colleagues in the AFP and across other government departments, state, local and federal. I know that they're extremely busy focused on all these various issues right now. I think it's really important for us to consider, and I know that David Bartlett's going to talk about this a little bit too, around what does it mean in terms of these mass attacks in Australia. For me, what I've seen over my history and experience, and also I sit on a range of boards now, so one of them includes the ACT Sentence Administration Board, which is like the parole board. We're just seeing this huge amount of violence in our communities. So violence in our family situations, violence in workplace, violence out in the community and these sorts of incidents that have led us to bring this panel together today. I've had a look at some of the domestic violence statistics currently out there. For example, 1 woman is killed every 9 days in Australia. That's horrific. And it's by a current partner or former partner, so someone she generally knows. Of course, there are men and women who perpetrate these sorts of violent activities. Just think about the important social and economic impacts of all of those things across our communities and health impacts. There's also statistics around children and their experiences of violence in the home and in communities generally, and we're seeing that with the raft of media reporting and other reporting around youth crime, and there's so many different facets to this that we could probably have a series of webinars talking about all of this. I don't want to dwell on it too much today, but I think it's really critical that we do think about this in terms of that more strategic social issue, in terms of how do we start to tackle this to try to reduce and minimise the amounts of violent attacks out there in our communities and in our homes. Thanks, Joe. I'd like to save it for some questions.
Thank you very much, Leanne. And our final introduction for our third panelist is Dr. David Bartlett. He's a criminologist and researcher and the Director of Postgraduate and Continuing Education at the Griffith School of Criminology and Criminal Justice to provide us a criminology lens. Please welcome Dr. David Bartlett. Your opening thoughts, sir.
Thanks, Joe, and thank you for having me. I'd just like to offer a couple of opening thoughts, and they're really picking up on Leanne's comments there about violence in the Australian community generally, and also some of Gav's comments about Australia being a relatively safe place. I've been in this criminology space now for over 2 decades, and I've noticed how things have changed in terms of society, in terms of crime and those sorts of things. And as Leanne said, you know, we do have an epidemic of violence here, particularly around domestic and family violence. When we think about violent crime in Australia, you're far more likely to be victimised by someone you know, usually a partner or a former partner, a colleague, a relative, whoever it is. You're far more likely to be victimised by those people than you are a stranger. However, these mass events, such as that we saw at Bondi Junction on the weekend, I sort of hesitate to say they're unusual because we've had 6 in the last sort of 24 odd years. I think the thing is our memories become very short in terms of once we have these incidents, we have a response, and then it all sort of tends to drop off a little bit. Then we have another incident, and it sort of gets picked up again. You know, you think about those incidents. I think that if people are thinking about these incidents in terms of just the count, so you know we've had 6 in 24 years, so you go, okay, on average we have them every 6 years. That's actually the wrong way to think about these incidents, because these incidents cause considerable harm. If we think about crime in terms of harm and the amount of harm they cause to the community, not just in terms of direct harm, but also indirect harms to people who witnessed the incidents, people who are family, friends of people who witnessed the incidents, to first responders and so on. These events are incredibly harmful. Now, to Gav's point, I think at the start about Australia being, you know, you sort of indicating Australia is a relatively safe place, and I think that's right. And I think that's actually to our detriment in how we think about this, because these incidents are relatively rare. As I said, we tend to sort of lose focus on what we need to be doing on a regular basis to prevent them. And I think that this incident, if there's anything positive to come out of this, it's perhaps a wake-up call that we need to get our eye back on the ball in terms of how do we control situations, how do we manage situations that we find ourselves in, where we can minimise down the effects of these types of incidents. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you very much, panelists, for their opening thoughts. I would just like to remind everyone watching there is a live Q&A. So there is a Q&A panel, a Q&A button that you can press if you would like to ask questions. We do have some prepared questions, but we'll try to get to as many audience questions as possible as time allows. But certainly we will provide contact details if you wish to follow up and have further conversations with any of our panelists also. So the first question I've got is actually for Leanne. So I think it's useful to set the scene for us, I guess, and answer a question that perhaps some who aren't in the national security space or the terrorism space may be asking is why was the attack at the church considered a terror attack and the Bondi attack was not considered a terror attack? Sure, clearly the Bondi attack had a higher casualty rate. It's caused terror. What's the difference, and why is one being considered a terror attack and the other one not?
Good question, Joe. So it comes down to the motivation generally of the attacker, and police have to look at a range of factors. They won't automatically make an assumption at the very big start of an investigation. They'll look at all of the circumstances. They've made a call quite early in relation to the incidents at the church in Wakeley in New South Wales, based on their knowledge of the young person involved. Obviously, they've looked at some of the statements that person's possibly made to other people on social media, etc. And they've called it a terrorist incident because it also opens up some broader powers, specialist powers for investigation, for cross-sharing of information, additional resourcing, etc. So they've looked at it in that respect. The incident in Bondi, that horrific incident, again, they would have done exactly the same sorts of assessments early on, having a look at first having to identify who the offender was, looking at any statements that person's made, what their potential motivation may be. And there's a lot of work that goes in behind that in terms of speaking to family, friends, other people that have had interactions with him. In that instance, it became apparent fairly quickly that he had mental health history and issues, but that wouldn't stop police at looking at potentially there were other issues at play here, and things can change over time. They won't just make a call at the beginning of an incident. So that's predominantly where different powers come into it. Interestingly, in Australia too, a final comment in relation to motivation and motive, it's not something you have to prove at court in Australia. It is something that certainly goes to the circumstances around it, but it's not something that you have to prove in terms of presenting the facts at a court or coronial inquiry, where you're trying to determine what's occurred, what offences has that person perpetrated, and therefore what penalty may apply.
Yeah, thank you for that, Leanne. I think it's also important, just because I think a lot of the discourse from people that are not practitioners in this field might be feeling like maybe one is terrorism just because it seems to be religiously motivated. But it should also be noted that terrorism extends far beyond purely religious motivations, and certainly there are some interesting aspects to the Bondi attack as well. I do know that through my work with the threat assessment and management community, especially the ATAP community in the US, they've been looking at the incel group as potentially whether they border on terrorism. It's with the growth of figures such as Andrew Tate and other misogynist, I guess, commentators out there, whether that's radicalization as well. It's an interesting piece of the puzzle that ultimately, as I know we were discussing earlier, regardless of the motivation, it doesn't change the response in the moment. In the moment, people that are there, the business owners, the church or the house of worship leadership, don't need to know what the motivation is. They need to know how to keep their people safe. So thank you for providing that explanation for anyone who might be wondering. My next question is for David. You mentioned before some statistics regarding how frequent these attacks are. From a criminology point of view, do you think that these attacks really are unexpected? And I know that there's been a lot of discourse around knife crime and whether knives need to be controlled. I'd like welcome your thoughts on whether we should be expecting this, whether we should be expecting more of this, and what role, if any, the availability of knives has to do with it.
Thanks, Joe. Good questions. Should we expect more of it? I think if we look at history, we would say yes, absolutely. If you can plot back over 30, 40, 50 years, Gav mentioned his opening comments, Port Arthur. These types of incidents they're not new. They've been around for quite some time, and they will continue to be. Whether they increase or not, sort of going forward, what I would say is it's interesting looking at those 6 incidents that have occurred in the last 24 years. The gap between the first one and the second one was about 8 years, and those gaps tend to be getting shorter. Between some of those incidents, there's only a couple of years. So if you look just at that little window, You'd sort of say, yeah, in terms of frequency, yeah, probably. But the other thing that I would point out is that societies change. So we think about our physical environments are changing, the way we interact is changing. So there's a whole lot of social determinants around this that probably affect it as well. So they can affect it positively or negatively. So, you know, it's always important in terms of prevention to think about what we can be doing to affect that bigger picture, socially and also within, you know, our sort of micro environments. Coming to knives, that's a really interesting point. In his opening comment, Gav made a comment about Port Arthur, and of course the Australian government's response to Port Arthur was to put in some of the best gun control measures in the world. Because we've been so successful at that, it means that knives have really become the weapon of choice for offenders. So if you look at people who are unfortunately victims of homicide offences, about 40% are victims of knife attacks. Knives are lethal and they're readily available, and I think that's what makes them an ideal sort of choice of weapon for an offender who can't get their hands on guns, because we do control them quite well. Now that poses a whole range of other issues, and just in terms of stats there, when you think about murders, about 10% involve a firearm versus about 40% that involve a knife. So in terms of prevention, that's really tricky, because what we know is that we've all got knives. We've got knives in our kitchens. In terms of how do you regulate knives and those sorts of things, you know, that's a whole other webinar. What we know, for example, in Queensland, is it recently in the last little while introduced what's known as Jack's Law, where police can, without reasonable suspicion, stop someone in a safe night precinct and wand them with a metal detector to see if they're carrying a knife. Now, interestingly, what I can say is some of the knives that are found are absolutely frightening out of those operations. The second thing I'd say is that the Queensland government had been thinking about, or at least canvassing the idea of extending that to shopping centres, and they sort of thinking about this a few months ago. Whether that position changes, and I don't know what their position was at the time, but that, you know, the events of the weekend might sort of colour that. However, I think we need to be really careful here in terms of thinking about this being a police issue, because it's actually not a police issue. The other thing is that offenders adapt. Offenders will, for example, adapt and start using ceramic knives, which will bypass metal detectors. So I think we need to think about this holistically in terms of how do we prevent the bigger picture issues rather than focusing on knives. So I think there has been a lot of focus on the knife, because the knife's the common denominator, right, between Bondi and the place of worship attack.
Yes, indeed, and good thoughts there. And ultimately, I think the point that perpetrators will evolve to address what is available to them is a good point. And I think the preliminary information that's coming out of the Wakely attack was that the knife that was used was actually an illegal knife. I believe it was a flick knife, which is prohibited. So if that is the case, then the law against that knife didn't necessarily have much effect. But even if knives were harder to get, it's reasonable to assume people would find other ways to achieve their goal, unfortunately. So the next question we've got is for Dr. Gav. What do you think are the primary steps that public precincts, whether that's a shopping centre, whether it's a place of worship, need to take to enhance their security and prevent incidents, or at least mitigate the consequences when they do occur? And this is a huge topic. It could be a book. In fact, he's written one, which you can find online. But what are the primary steps that people should be looking at to try and address these issues?
Thanks, Joe. As you said, that is a big question, and it's also one that I'll start off with a caveat to say, while there are similarities, and I guess some of the advice that I'll provide is more generic, there's a requirement to customize everything for your people, your site, your requirements. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to the way we tackle risk. And in this case, if we're talking about the risk of active arm offenders specifically, we've learned many, many things over the years. And what really does frustrate and annoy experts like me and my colleagues on the panel is when people think this is a new type of incident just because it happened now. We've been seeing these sort of attacks continuously for decades. And while there's been a level of separation between, for example, Australia and the US, where we go, well, we're not a gun culture, so we don't see that rampant level of ongoing continuous firearm attacks. We need to look at a few things. So the first thing, and the first point of advice, is we need to remove the veil of denial, negligence, and ignorance that tends to permeate owner-operators' mindsets when it comes to tackling these risks. We saw 2016-17, there was a lot of work done on crowded places strategy by the ANZ CTC. They released guidance that is useful and practical guidance that helps owners of public precincts and places address, understand, and manage these risks. I think to the point that had been made earlier, people jumped on top of that back then. It lost attention and it lost urgency and it lost frequency as a result of COVID, cybercrime, many other pieces. The challenge we've got is humans are not great at multitasking. In fact, the research shows we can't multitask. We just switch between tasks, which means when we look at risk management, we're not great at managing multiple risks simultaneously. In fact, one of the key reasons we should be looking at things differently, both based on what Leanne and Dave Bartlett said earlier, is that no matter what we do, people with ill intent will evolve. And we keep seeing this. So if we only put the bare minimum in place, we are significantly more vulnerable than somebody who's put a little bit more than the bare minimum in place. So while this is not an arms race to security, because this is something everyone should be doing, there are some minimum requirements we need to start with. So accepting the fact that it could happen to you, your place of business, or it might be that you are in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then it happens to you, is step one. Once we accept it, we can own it. Two, it's different from different stakeholders, but I was very positively buoyed, and maybe it shows how long we've been doing this. It's probably 6 or 7 years ago now, when I chaired a panel a good few years ago with the former Queensland Police Commissioner, Ian Stewart, at the time. And this goes back a while ago. And even then, he was saying, look, the biggest challenge we've got is to start learning how to work with business, work with the public, and all of us get behind minimizing, tackling crime. This is a significant mindset shift for Australia. Okay, having worked in more than 16 countries so far, Australia is very much stuck in the mindset that the authorities are the only capable, competent responders to be able to deal with these attacks. And while I don't doubt for a second they are the most competent and most qualified based on the training and vetting you need to become a sworn law enforcement officer, we've seen it takes time for them to get there. And even in a superstar response like we saw in the Bondi attack, okay, by Inspector Amy Scott, which is incredible that it, her training and her mindset enabled her to do the right thing right up to the point of providing first aid post-incident. It's a really good testament that we've got great people protecting us. We need to accept the fact that the first responders are the people there. And as the ANZ CTC guidance tells us, we've got a basic set of responses: escape, hide, and tell. They don't work in a linear structure. They work in an integrated structure. But we can tie that back to human response, which is fight, flight, freeze, and panic. And if you haven't built your own response plan and things go wrong, unfortunately, the negative outcome is usually for you. So one of the things I think we need to work on now is to change that mindset away from going, it's only the law enforcement community's responsibility, or it's only the owner of a shopping centre or a church or a place of worship or a football stadium. If we really want to ensure that Australia is safe and secure moving forward, this is an entire societal problem. And we have to change our mindset away from thinking this is a specific silo that needs to be tackled by only a specific group of people. And interestingly enough, this will be probably my last point on the topic because we keep going, is that realistically, the tools that enable us to identify suspicious behavior, respond in time and prevent something bad from happening, work the same whether somebody wanted to commit an armed robbery, an active armed offender attack, whether they were having a mental health issue, or whether they were just lost. There are lots of things we can integrate to be able to get early detection, prevention, and response more effective. But it takes training, it takes time, it takes effort. I'd urge all of you listening in to not let cost be a barrier to this. You can make it better without spending a cent, but it does take effort, energy, and a mindset shift. And my humble request back to all of you who've on short notice jumped onto this webinar, and we're very grateful for that, that we've got to move the mindset from one of there's nothing that can be done, or it's not my problem, to what can I do to make sure these things never happen again? And if we start off with the mindset of the individual taking responsibility for themselves and then extending that to how to help others, for example, if we look at the Bondi attack, it's wonderful to actually see that some of the retailers have obviously been training their people, and they've been doing a good job when the lockdowns were effective, when civilians were getting dragged into protection. You know there's training and things happening. We've heard many cases where that wasn't the case, where staff were panicking and it wasn't an organized response. So use this as a learning. There's no point looking backwards. We are where we are. What's happened has happened. Let's make sure from moving forward from this day on, nobody goes, I don't know what to do in this sort of incident. No owner of a crowded place goes, this won't happen to us. We don't have to worry about it. And we really adopt a strategy of working with our first responders, with law enforcement, to feed them information ahead of time, which is how we proactively prevent the majority of bad things happening, and facilitate effective response wherever possible. And I'm really buoyed to see that we're also getting very positive feedback for the civilians who participated in helping in the response and in mitigating casualties. Historically, that hasn't been something that's been celebrated in Australia. It's wonderful to see that we are celebrating this, and we're going to have to be doing more of it if we're really going to tackle these issues more effectively. Thanks, Joe.
Right, we are getting inundated with some really great questions, so I'm going to deviate from my questions and see how many of these audience questions we can get to. Again, apologies, folks. We will not get to all the questions in the depth that they deserve. So if your question doesn't get answered, please do reach out to us afterwards. We're still happy to provide insight as we can. David, I'm going to give this one to you first, and I'm going to combine a couple of questions because I think they're related. One person asked or commented essentially that the fatigue of COVID and other distractions has made this sort of less topical and not in the public eye. And then Olivia also asked, how can we make sure these don't become normalized to such events such as the US, where mass killing events occur so frequently? So I think there's probably a double-edged sword. How do we give this the appropriate amount of attention and coverage without it becoming so normal that it doesn't even warrant more than a 30-second news bite? Do you have any thoughts on that from a criminology point of view? I know it's a really big topic.
I have lots of thoughts, and I'm just trying to pair them back to something that's manageable in this time slot. Can I make a point firstly? And this is something that before the webinar we were talking about with Leanne. It was around social media. I've got some real concerns around the way that social media presented this, and I know that other people do as well. What we see with mainstream media is that there's a level of fact checking that goes on. There's time taken to get a report right. There's ethical considerations, and so on. I think once we start to buy into this social media thirst for information right now, we start to see people putting up things that perhaps they shouldn't in terms of video, and people start to make comments around that. And I think that desensitizes people to these sorts of incidents, and I think that's really problematic. The other thing is it sort of sets up a platform for disinformation, and we did see this coming out of the Bondi Junction incident as well. So in terms of normalising it, I think we just need to be really careful about use of social media and how social media can play a role in that. Can I think about the US? I think in your question, Joe, the comment was around how we not make this sort of common like in the US. Australia culturally is very different, and I think that's one of our strengths. We are very different to the US in a whole range of areas. Like, we don't have access to guns, but even just socially, I think Australians are very different. And I think that is one of our strengths. And I think that when we start to think about how do we prevent these attacks in future, we actually play to our strengths. I think that's really important. And you can develop strategies around that in terms of policies and procedures and those sorts of things that you build in. For example, Australians are quite laid back, but we also tend to be quite observant. So, just making sure that people are being observant, are being told to be observant and to report things as well. So I think that Joe, the first part of that question, sorry, I don't think I've addressed it. Can you run that past me again?
No, I think it's really just the dichotomy of us not paying attention to it at all because we're distracted by other things, or becoming so immune to it because it happens so frequently. Like, where do we find the balance?
Yeah, and look, I think we've just got to keep this at, in the front of our minds, and we tend not to, and try not to forget about it in the coming weeks and months. We know that these events will happen again, and I think it's about leaders in particular industries and that are susceptible to these sorts of things, making sure they keep a focus on it, making sure that boards, for example, keep a focus on it. Boards are critical here. We know, for example, in Australia that when workplace health and safety legislation changed and boards became responsible for workplace health and safety obligations, all of a sudden they were very interested in knowing about what their organisations were doing because the directors didn't want to go to jail. I think boards need to be focused on this as well. Can I pick up, while I've got the floor, can I pick up on a comment that Gav made? And it's just around big pictures. Sometimes the people will be thinking, oh, okay, I've got to develop a strategy for preventing knife attacks, but I've also got this develop a strategy around loss prevention, around all these things. Can I tell you that this, pull it all together? We know there's decades of research on 26 techniques of crime prevention. If you pull them all together in a plan, in an overarching plan, you'll actually address all of these things rather than addressing them all in individual silos. And that's a far more efficient way to go.
Great points. I might just move on to the next question. And if any of our panelists want to chime in, feel free to jump off mute and interrupt me. I won't take offense to it. Yeah, this is all gold. Leanne, I might just direct this next one to you first. It comes from Andrew Methven. He says, working for an allied health business that has multiple small locations, so 180 sites with 2 to 5 people on site at each, we too have seen a rise in the reports of aggression from clients and public, especially post-COVID. Do the panel have any insights or thoughts on key messages we can provide our people who think that we are, quote unquote, not doing enough to keep them safe, but security guards and locked doors are not a practical or cost-effective solution? First thoughts from Leanne?
Yeah, look, another great question. Thank you. There is so much we can do, and Gav touched on it earlier, that you can do for virtually no money, but good effort, good coordination. I sit on a range of boards, as you saw in the opening, and David's just touched on this as well. Having that overarching risk plan's great, and you really need to think about, have a comprehensive risk plan, but it's not good if it just sits there as a spreadsheet and you look at it once a year. Boards, executives in organisations, managers, team leaders throughout an organisation all have a responsibility here. If that plan is taken seriously and it's looked at regularly to say, what are our key risks? How do we transfer that information into staff? And vice versa, how does staff brief up that information through their teams? How do they have that consistent level of information across the teams as well? So a couple of things there for managers in organisations. First of all, telling your people that they are the most important thing within that company or business, that they don't have all the answers at the top of a business, but they're responsible for ensuring that there is planning in place. It's simple to run a few scenarios. You can do it online. You can do desktop scenario planning. You can allocate if you're not big enough to allocate a dedicated security officer or chief cyber officer or chief risk officer. You can allocate that to somebody and you can make them responsible, helping coordinate that for you. And then you have regular exercises, regular training, and it can be desktop again, doesn't have to be hugely expensive things. And just making sure that people know that you've got policies in place, what they are, what your lockdown procedures might be. And again, Gab touched on this earlier, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So you do have to look at what are the circumstances of your business, what are those potential risks, internal, external, having conversations, getting the right people, providing those briefings to you is critical. So it really, for me, the bottom line is it goes to the culture of an organisation as well. A culture where people can feel safe to say, I want to report something, I don't feel safe in a certain circumstance, and there can be a mature, appropriate conversation about what are some of the risk treatments or things you need to put in place to make sure that that risk is mitigated. And getting people involved in it. I think just touching back on something we were talking about earlier in terms of knife crime and other things, internationally, it's no surprise we're experiencing in Australia. Britain's been experiencing this sort of knife crime for years, and those things translate. I touched on the youth crime issue earlier. That's something that social media is perpetrating, being people filming themselves are doing absolutely stupid acts and things to get attention on social media. So I know there's a lot of work happening in the background about social media companies and their responsibilities, as well as having discussions with individuals. And finally, for an individual, I'd also say if you want to do some things, first of all, the most simple thing is if you see something, say something. We have amazing services and mechanisms across the community with Crime Stoppers. You know, the 1800 333 000 number is a good one. We've got, if you want to be able to do something as well, first aid. Are you first aid trained for yourself, for your family, for your community, your business? But yeah, getting back to Andrew's question, just in relation to that organisational aspect, have your plans in place. Don't set and forget. Talk about them regularly, update them, mature them, and having that focus at the top will help people realise that that is important to their organisation.
Perfect, thanks, Lee. I'll go to Gav in just a second, but if I can just add one thing there from our work with a lot of client organisations. I noticed Andrew's comment was about people thinking they're not doing enough. Sometimes that's just a matter of perception, and one of the easy answers to that is let people know what you're doing. You might be doing a lot of stuff in the background that people on the front line are not aware of. They don't know what measures have been put in place to keep them safe. And therefore, it's easy for the fear to cause scuttlebutt that maybe is not accurate. So sometimes it's about sharing the positive messages, not just the new controls or the protocols or the restrictions that are going to make their life harder. So there's about messaging as well. Gav?
Thanks, Joe. Totally agree with everything that's been said so far. That's awesome. Just maybe a slight bolt on there based on Andrew's question. And anybody who's attended anything to do with psych risk that I ever speak about has always heard me talk about the challenge we often face is that perception is reality to the perceiver. And Joe, you just alluded to that. One of the fundamental things we've got to concentrate on doing is finding this balance between, we don't want people paranoid. People who are stressed and hypervigilant are poor performers. It increases mental health issues, increases physical health issues, and ultimately actually perpetrates violence and aggression. So being paranoid is not where we want to go. Being prepared and being able to have the level of confidence that you know what to do in worst case scenarios is really important. That creates the confidence. So I think one of the challenges we've seen, and I would urge those of you in the position where you're facing having to solve challenges like this with almost no budget, don't fall into the risk theatre trap where you go, right, I'm just going to buy a duress device, for example, or I'm just going to put up a camera, or I'll just put up a lock on the door and then I'll forget about it and say it's done. There's no universal one thing you can do that will bring it together. There are lots of integrated things, and Dave B mentioned earlier, just the idea of integrating criminological practice into the way you tackle these challenges. But I would really suggest this is the opportunity for us to look at least, we talk about 4 layers. Self. If the individual cannot come up with a plan for themselves to keep themselves safe, it doesn't matter what you do in the workplace because they're not always at your workplace. They're working from home, they're working from anywhere. So it's not good enough just to secure the spot they're in. We have to train them to be able to identify what they need to do for themselves. Step 2 then is how we do that as a team. So if you are at a place where there's a group of people, or you're going out with colleagues, or you're going out with your family even, if you don't have a plan, if something goes wrong, that means you're making it up on the fly and you're more likely to land up with a negative outcome. If you've got a well-rehearsed and prepared plan, it's more likely you will do that. Remember the idea of escape, hide, tell, linked back to fight, flight, freeze, and panic, and making sure we understand our instinctive responses based on the guidance is really important. Third level is the organization, and this is one of the things I think we have to undo. The organization tends to be blamed. The organization is the one we hold up as the one responsible. Even in the crowded places strategy, and for those of you who have to go influence your boards, it clearly states in the crowded places strategy that the owner-operator of a crowded place has the duty of care to secure and ensure safety for the people attending that crowded place. The leverage, the responsibility has been put back onto the organization. The organization cannot do it alone. It needs its people to buy in and participate if we're going to get efficacy. So for organizations, there actually is nowhere to hide. You need to own this. You need to step up to this. It has to be something important. And to Lee's point, if we're not talking about this at board level, well, then you'll probably be talking about it at a coroner's inquiry, or you'll be wondering why For example, sales have dropped tremendously and nobody wants to come to your retail outlet, or people don't want to attend your place of worship anymore because they don't feel safe. And then the last point is, if we get those first three right, then society gets safer. So we've kind of had this idea that we set structures at society, everybody follows those, and we create safety. Things have changed so much, it's too dynamic now. We don't have the luxury of going, we set legislation at federal, then state, then maybe local government level, and with that legislation or regulation in place, we are safe and secure. Things move too quick, the world has changed, we need to empower ourselves, but we need to align that empowerment and integrate it. We will then start to get good outcomes.
Right. I'm conscious that we've got about 14 minutes left, so maybe 2 or 3 more questions and a closing comment. Gav, I might just stay with you for this one to start with, because I think it's relevant. Catherine, again, I'm going to combine a couple of questions, but Catherine says, do you think security officers in shopping centres or high-profile places are adequately equipped with evolving situational awareness and critical thinking skills for handling of critical incidents? There was other commentary in the Q&A about employers not really equipping their staff appropriately to be able to manage these situations. We've seen a lot of discourse online about it's too easy to become a security officer. They don't have any equipment. They don't have any training. Sadly, we've seen in the Bondi attack, a security officer was killed attempting to assist. I've seen a lot of discourse around whether all security should be issued with stab-proof vests, whether security officers should have tasers or pepper spray or batons or firearms. Or what do you think? Let's talk about it from a training point of view first, and from an equipment point of view second. What do we need to be looking at to empower security professionals who ultimately are far more in number and far more able to respond quickly than police will be?
Thanks, Joe, for grouping those questions together. That's a whole webinar or a 4-day lecture. Depends which way you want to go. You've got 3
minutes. I'm sorry.
I'll do it. I'll try and do it in 2, Joe. All right. So I think the first thing to accept is the fact that more regulation, more training requirements are not necessarily going to equip people better. Doing an initial training course and recurrent training once every 2 or 3 years is sufficient in terms of equipping us with basic skills. The challenge we've got with the security industry is manifold. The first one is we often see that the industry is considered an industry for people who can't get jobs elsewhere. So we're not always seeing the right level of talent come into the industry, which often then leads to people who might not have the right physical or emotional makeup working in such an industry. That then cascades back to, in many cases, and if you're in the retail or crowded spaces environment, I'd urge you to think about this. Many cases, security officers are not allowed to go hands-on. They're actually not allowed to intervene. So corporate policy for a lot of places that use security guards tell them their job is to observe and report and provide customer service. So I think this is an important differentiator, because if a security officer has been used in that role, their response is based on the concept or the legal premise of self-defense or necessity, as opposed to it being their job, because their job was not to intervene, their job was to observe and report. So I think we've got to be really careful. This is a technical slippery slope. Your observation is accurate too. There are significantly more private security officers in Australia than there are law enforcement officers. And some are incredibly well trained. Many of them are former law enforcement officers or have done other jobs. So I think part of the challenge we've got too is to change this mindset from what is the cheapest way I can acquire a security service to can I get the right security service? And can I get the right competency out of my security service? That does not mean more regulation. That does not mean putting more licensing requirements in place. We're over-regulated it, and we can't even get our existing licensing right with the security industry. So that's got to change. What we need to do is have a level of honesty that most of the skills we're talking about now are what we refer to as perishable skills. If we don't keep them up to speed, they fade. So you're never trained, you're always training. That requires the employer, and it requires the client contracting the employer to ensure that ongoing and regular training occurs. I see that as the primary fault at this stage. In terms of equipment, right, it does depend on the role of the security officer. But I would say we are missing a significant opportunity if we haven't at least, for example, taught security officers in crowded places tools like swarming, where 5 to 10 security officers all swarm on somebody to take them down, which has been proven to be quite an effective methodology. And we see civilians do that more often. So if we move to stab-proof vests, great, it's another risk control. If we look at our hierarchy of safety, it's good, but that comes with a cost. And it also means that if somebody wants to hit a security guard in the head with a brick, the vest is not going to be useful. So I would really urge us to have an holistic view on this and not go, we need guards to only wear, stab resistant vests. We need to look at the way we hire, the way we employ, the way we deploy, the way we retrain, and the way we equip as a holistic package. And we need to change the mindset away from the lowest common denominator and treating security officers like they're unappreciated to actually starting to celebrate the difficult job these people do when things go wrong. Sorry, but a bit of a high point for me there, but you could tell I'm passionate about this one, Joe.
That's why I threw it to you, Gav. Thank you for that. I just want to clean up a couple of small comments. Peter Price, CEO of Crime Stoppers, says we really need people to use the systems available. As Leanne said, use Crime Stoppers. It's there for people to report even suspect behaviour, but caution, people can be prosecuted for vexatious behaviour. Thank you very much for joining us, Peter. But that is a great point. We need to make people aware of the systems that are already in place. I know I had this conversation with my parents. They're asking me whether I saw an ad for something. I said, I don't watch TV. I don't see ads. I don't see it. So maybe we need to look at how people are communicating that some of those support services that are already there. There was another comment. Someone asked, sorry, I'm just scrolling back up. For organizations to be ready to respond to such incidents, is there a consultant that can be reached to run a simulation exercise? The answer to that is yes, we can. But as I said at the beginning, it's not a place for us to be selling products, but feel free to reach out afterwards. We'd be happy to assist. Next question, I'm conscious that we need to be moving towards the end, but David and Leanne, I think this is probably a shared question for you. I thought it was kind of meaty. Michael says, are we at a point where we need to consider evolving the National Terrorism Threat Advisory System to not be so terrorism-centric and perhaps to be a public safety threat level? This could then encompass other threats with motivations like mental health, youth crime, and possibly even up to and including foreign interference. The consequences of all of these incidents will be felt by all Australians as much, if not more, than terrorism alone. I know I'm really setting you up with a hard ask to answer that question briefly, but thoughts from maybe Leanne first?
I love this question, and I'm actually a huge advocate of national security being considered much more broader than either defence related and external security or terrorism related only for internal security. I agree with you, Michael. It really is about the whole of our national security. You mentioned their mental health. We talked about family violence and how prolific it is out there in our communities, violence generally. I think we do need to have that broader conversation. What do I think then that means for our conversations? I was a part of the Australian New Zealand Counter-Terrorism Committee, and it was an excellent organisation that was led by then the Department of Home Affairs. I haven't had much to do with it since I've left in the last 4 and a bit years. That was a great organisation for coordinating across particularly Commonwealth agencies and state-based agencies. Had an ear to the Prime Minister because it was at that national level, and ministers to guide people on legislative policy, joint interoperability training, exercising, all of those sorts of things that our public entities like police, emergency services needed to work together, particularly in post-incident, but even in the planning preparation phase, sharing intelligence, etc. So I do think that there is scope to have an entity that focuses on a broader definition of national security. But a word of caution, it needs a strong coordinator. It needs a strong level of support. It needs someone who is good at taking their ego out of the picture and bringing groups together and working not just with government but with the private sector as well. And Gav touched on the crowded places strategy, which was again an excellent body of work that was jointly undertaken, but with big organisations that had responsibility for crowded places, working with government, identifying strategies, government not being prescriptive of what that meant because each organisation needed to have its own plans, its training, sharing that information. Getting back to one quick point that I made earlier, though, it's also not set and forget. You just cannot build these things because people change in organisations, policies move on. And quickly on the training issue, in policing, we would retrain every 12 months. even at the highest levels, I went and redid the training because I wanted to see what my teams were undertaking, what new advice or information we were focused on, you know, what was changing in society that we needed to understand, how that affected our use of force training, our communication negotiations, etc., etc. So it's an investment by organisations. If we want to have the highest calibre of security officers in Australia, we need to invest in them, and we need to continually do that and not just do it once. Thanks, Joe.
Great, thank you for that. David, I might throw to you for your thoughts on that, and also any closing thoughts as we start to round out the webinar.
Thanks, Joe. I support wholeheartedly what Leanne's just said. I think what we've been very good at doing is establishing silos. There's the counterterrorism silo. There's, you know, all these different silos, and quite often they don't talk to each other. That you were lucky if they talk within each other. So you've got to talk across these silos. But as Leanne said, it requires a very strong coordinator who can bring all those different groups together and have a big picture view of this. I think what we've done is create silos and then hired people into those particular silos without thinking about how their skills are applied more generally across other areas or other silos. Final thoughts. Look, I think the coming weeks and months will continue to be difficult. I think this is really shaken a lot of people and shaken the Australian community. I think the challenge for us, though, is in the coming weeks and months to continue to focus on where to from now. Let's not lose the opportunity that this has created, and I don't use that term lightly. And this is a tragic event, but it's an opportunity for everyone to sit back and go, hang on, what happened here? We know something similar is probably going to happen in the future. What do we do to lessen the harm? To lessen the harm to our people, our staff, our customers, lessen the harm to our neighbours, to our general community. So they're my parting thoughts, Joe.
Thank you very much, Dr. David Bartlett. Leanne, any closing thoughts from yourself?
Look, just echoing the thoughts we've had already, really, Australia is a magnificent place to live. We saw some really heroic people from our community, from within law enforcement, emergency services. Every single day they're seeing these sorts of situations and having to make those judgment calls and decisions. So there is a lot of help out there, and we can all do our little bit, but we shouldn't be totally fearful. We live in an amazing society. We just need to be vigilant and observant and make sure that when we see something not right or going wrong with someone, we can help in whatever way is appropriate for us.
Fantastic. And final thoughts from Dr. Gav?
Thanks, Joe. We've got a lot of work to do, and I think the emphasis is on we. It's not an individual responsibility, and I really would state that we shouldn't be creating feelings of isolation or helplessness now. We know what to do to minimize the likelihood of these sort of attacks happening. We also know what to do to limit and minimize the damage when such attacks occur. Equally, we know that in many cases, you may not be able to avoid or totally prevent an attack, so you need a response capability. The challenge now is, are we going to get serious about this? And I would strongly suggest now this is an opportunity to integrate, as David Bartlett highlighted. Most of what we're seeing now is the after effect in terms of mental health issues, lack of confidence in organizations or public places to ensure effective security. And for the most part, honestly, as we were talking, I just thought I'd do a little activity, and I Googled the murder rate back in South Africa just to have a look. It's about 37 a day reported, which probably puts it at about 50 to 100 in actual fact. So Australia is safe. Like, if we compare this to many other parts of the world, we are doing pretty well, but we should not forget the realities that people are stressed. Financial pressures are hitting lots of people. We've got global geopolitical risks. People are still coping with the challenges of post-COVID reality. We are bombarded with negativity, misinformation, disinformation continuously. While all of these variables are in play, it's almost a guarantee we will see high levels of continuous and ongoing violence, which every now and again will extend to acts of mass violence or public violence, like we saw in the case of the church. this is an opportunity, as Dave Bartlett said, for us to do better. But equally, we shouldn't forget that people are hurting and we need to be there for each other. Thanks, Joe.
Well said. Thank you very much, Dr. David Bartlett, Dr. Gav Schneider, Leanne Close, an amazing panel. Now, we are providing a free resource at the moment. If anyone is in need, we have made our Active Armed Offender e-learning course, which is actually an award-winning course. We have made that free for the next month. So the details are on the screen there. Feel free to scan the QR code and grab that coupon code. This webinar will be recorded. If you wish to share this with more people, share it with your teams, then that recording will be live and will be emailed out tomorrow morning, I believe. But this is one resource that is maybe of interest to you. The other resource, as I alluded to earlier, is Dr. Gav Schneider's book, Can I See Your Hands? It's a fantastic primer on personal safety, situational awareness, and personal security at the individual level, with many lessons to be applied across both personally and in organizations. And the other book, which is coming out at the end of this month, is actually my book, which is the book Protecting the Faith, a handbook for securing Australian churches, for those that may be in that position where you are in need of some advice on how to get started with church security. Lastly, anyone, I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. There were so many fantastic questions. But if there's anything else we can assist you with, if there's support you need, guidance you need, a sounding board, just to brain dump what you're currently doing and see whether there's anything you could be doing differently, we are here to help. We are here to support you. Please feel free to reach out to Dave Cohen, our Group Head of Solutions Integration. He's more than happy to talk to you or to refer you to the right person. But we are here. This is what we were built for. We were built to help organizations and individuals through these types of issues. So thank you once again to our fantastic panelists. Thank you so much for an incredible number of attendees who popped on at relatively short notice. We threw this together yesterday afternoon and we've been blown away by the number of attendances. And as I said, the recording will be distributed tomorrow morning if you wish to share it with others. Thank you very much. Stay safe, look after each other, and have a great afternoon.